The blood-red sun cast long shadows across the barren California wilderness as three black-clad women trudged along a dusty trail that seemed to lead nowhere. Their shoulders slumped under the weight of grief as much as from the physical burden of their sparse belongings. Josephine Parker, the youngest at 23, wiped perspiration from her brow while her companions, Margaret Holloway and Elizabeth Richmond, both in their 30s, continued forward with vacant expressions that had become familiar since they'd each lost their husbands. The summer of 1871 had been unforgiving to the small mining settlement of Copper Creek. A cave-in at the Northern Star mine had claimed the lives of 17 men, including the husbands of these three women, leaving them with nothing but crushing debt and painful memories. "We should rest," Margaret suggested, her voice cracking from thirst. "The next town can't be much farther." "There might not be a next town," Elizabeth replied, adjusting her threadbare shawl. "The man at the general store said there's nothing but wilderness for miles." Josephine clutched her mother's locket, the only valuable she hadn't sold to pay off her late husband's gambling debts. "We keep walking until we find something, or—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The alternative was too bleak to voice aloud. None of them had a destination in mind. With their homes seized by creditors and the townspeople's charity exhausted, the widows had simply started walking east one morning, as if some collective instinct had taken hold. Nowhere seemed as good a destination as anywhere when you had nothing left to lose. The distant thunder of hoofbeats broke their solemn silence. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the setting sun. The women tensed, hands instinctively moving toward their meager possessions. Strangers in these parts were as likely to bring danger as aid. As the rider approached, they could make out a tall figure atop a magnificent chestnut stallion. His hat was pulled low, but the glint of a sheriff's badge caught the fading sunlight. "Evening, ladies," the man called out, slowing his horse to a stop several paces away. He tipped his hat back, revealing a sun-weathered face with kind eyes that contradicted his imposing frame. "Yancey Jones, sheriff of Willits. Mind if I ask where you're headed?" The women exchanged glances. It was Josephine who spoke up, her chin lifted with the last remnant of pride she could muster. "Forward, Sheriff. Just forward." Sheriff Jones studied them with a gaze that seemed to take in everything: their worn boots, the thin wedding bands still adorning their fingers, the hopelessness in their eyes. "Forward leads to nothing but 50 miles of wilderness and mountain lions," he said, dismounting with fluid grace that belied his large frame. "And you ladies don't look equipped for either." Margaret stepped forward protectively. "We've managed this far." "And I admire your grit, madam," the sheriff replied, "but night's coming and this trail isn't friendly after dark." Elizabeth clutched her bag tighter. "We have nowhere to go back to." Something in her voice must have reached him, for his expression softened. He ran a hand through his sandy brown hair, contemplating the three desolate figures before him. "Willits is 8 miles back," he finally said. "Not a big place, but decent folks live there. Mill's hiring and the hotel needs help since the stagecoach route expanded." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "My sister runs a boarding house. Clean rooms, fair prices. Could use some helping hands, too." "We can't pay," Josephine admitted, the words bitter on her tongue. "Not until we find work." Sheriff Jones shrugged. "Rebecca has a soft spot for hard cases. We can sort out the details later." He gestured to his horse. "The weakest among you can ride. I'll walk alongside." The women hesitated, years of hard lessons making them wary of unexpected kindness. "Why would you help us?" Margaret asked bluntly. The sheriff's gaze drifted to the horizon before returning to them. Because 3 years ago my wife was walking a road not much different than this one. No one stopped to help her. His voice grew quiet. Found her 2 days later. Too late. The raw pain in those simple words resonated with their own grief. Without further discussion, they helped Elizabeth, who had been coughing since morning, onto the horse. Sheriff Jones took the reins and turned back toward Willits, the three widows following this unexpected guide toward what they dared not yet call hope. Josephine studied the sheriff's broad shoulders as he led them along the trail. There was something reassuring about his steady pace and the occasional backward glance to ensure they were managing. She wondered what kind of woman his wife had been and what circumstances had led her to that lonely road. How much farther? Margaret asked after they'd been walking for what seemed like hours. Just over that rise, Sheriff Jones pointed to a gentle hill ahead. You'll see the lights of Willits soon enough. True to his word, as they crested the hill, a small collection of lights twinkled in the valley below. It wasn't much a main street with wooden buildings on either side, a church steeple rising above the rest, and scattered houses spreading outward, but to the exhausted travelers, it looked like salvation. By the time they reached the town's edge, night had fully descended. The sheriff led them past the shuttered storefronts to a 2-story house set back from the main street. Light spilled from its windows and smoke curled from the chimney. "Rebecca," he called as he helped Elizabeth down from the horse. The door opened immediately, as if the occupant had been waiting. A woman with the same sandy hair as the sheriff appeared, wiping her hands on an apron. She took in the scene with a quick glance. "Bringing in strays again, Yancey." Her tone was chiding, but her smile was kind. "Found them headed nowhere fast," he replied. "Thought you might have some soup and beds to spare." Rebecca Jones stepped aside, gesturing them in. "Always room for those who need it. Come in before you catch your death out there." The interior was modest, but welcoming, a large common room with a stone fireplace, simple furniture polished to a shine, and the aroma of something delicious simmering in the kitchen. "I'm Rebecca Jones," she introduced herself as she bustled about, setting out bowls and cutting bread. "Don't mind my brother. He fancies himself the savior of lost souls." Sheriff Jones rolled his eyes good-naturedly as he hung his hat on a peg by the door. "Just doing my job, Becca." "Your job is upholding the law, not collecting waifs," she retorted, but the affection between them was evident. Josephine and her companions introduced themselves as they gratefully accepted the hot soup Rebecca served. The warmth spreading through Josephine's body from the simple meal almost brought tears to her eyes. It had been weeks since they'd eaten anything but hard bread and whatever wild berries they could forage. "So," Rebecca said, sitting down with them, "where are you coming from?" The women shared their story: the mine collapse, their desperate attempts to keep their homes, and the eventual decision to leave Copper Creek behind. 3 months' wages from the mine," Margaret said bitterly. "That's all they gave us for our husbands' lives." Sheriff Jones, who had been quietly listening from his position by the fire, spoke up. "The Northern Star Mine. Heard about that disaster. Owner skipped town after, if I recall correctly." "Maxwell Blackwell," Elizabeth confirmed. "Left in the night with the company funds. The foreman told us there wasn't enough to pay full compensation." The sheriff exchanged a glance with his sister. "Blackwell passed through Willits about a month ago. Flashy fellow, spending money like it was going out of style." Josephine's hands tightened around her bowl. "So he lied. Our husbands died and he profited." "Wouldn't be the first time," Sheriff Jones said grimly. "Mining companies have more lawyers than conscience these days." Rebecca stood abruptly. "That's enough talk of such things for tonight. These women need rest, not reminders." She showed them to a room upstairs with 2 beds. It's not much, but it's clean. We can figure out more permanent arrangements tomorrow." Left alone, the three widows looked at each other in the dim lamplight. "What do you think?" Elizabeth asked softly. "I think we've walked into something unexpected," Margaret replied. Josephine moved to the window, looking out at the sleeping town of Willits. "I think the sheriff might be the first honest man we've met in a long while." "Don't get your hopes up," Margaret warned. "Kindness usually comes with conditions." Elizabeth coughed weakly as she removed her shoes. "At this point, I'd accept most conditions for a roof and that soup." Josephine helped Elizabeth into bed, worry creasing her brow at the heat radiating from her friend's skin. "Let's just rest. Tomorrow will show us what Willits is really made of." As Josephine drifted into the first peaceful sleep she'd had since her husband's death, her last conscious thought was of Sheriff Jones's eyes, how they held both strength and a shadow of the same sorrow that had driven her and her friends to walk toward nowhere. Morning brought the smell of coffee and bacon. Josephine woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day rushed back. Elizabeth was still sleeping, her breathing labored while Margaret was already dressed, repairing a torn seam in her skirt. "She's gotten worse," Margaret whispered, nodding toward Elizabeth. Josephine placed a hand on Elizabeth's forehead. "She's burning up. I'll ask if there's a doctor in town." Downstairs, they found Rebecca preparing breakfast while Sheriff Jones studied some papers at the table. "Elizabeth is ill," Josephine announced without preamble. "She needs a doctor." Sheriff Jones stood immediately. "I'll fetch Dr. Harrison." "Wait," Rebecca said. "Sit and eat first. Timothy won't be at his office yet anyway. Always stops at the church at dawn." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded, returning to his seat. Josephine and Margaret joined them at the table, though Josephine found it hard to eat despite her hunger. "I know what you're thinking," Rebecca said gently, "but you need your strength. Elizabeth will need you strong." Josephine managed a few bites of the fluffy scrambled eggs. "How much will the doctor cost?" "Don't worry about that now," Sheriff Jones said. "We're not charity cases," Margaret stated firmly. The sheriff studied her for a moment. "No, you're not. You're survivors. And in Willits, we look after survivors." He rose, placing his hat on his head. "I'll get the doctor and be back shortly." After he left, Rebecca cleared the dishes. "My brother can be blunt, but he has a good heart. Lost his wife, Sarah, 3 years back. Influenza took her while he was away on a prisoner transfer. Found her on the road to the next town, trying to reach a doctor." She sighed. "Changed him, made him determined no one else should suffer alone if he could help it." This glimpse into the sheriff's past made Josephine see him in a new light. His kindness wasn't just professional duty, it was personal mission. Dr. Harrison arrived within the hour, a gentle-mannered man with spectacles and prematurely white hair. He examined Elizabeth thoroughly before delivering his verdict: pneumonia in its early stages, concerning but treatable with proper care. He left medicine and instructions, refusing payment when Josephine offered her mother's locket. "Keep your treasures, Miss Parker," he said kindly. "Sheriff Jones has arranged for my fee." After the doctor left, Josephine found the sheriff on the porch, whittling a small piece of wood. "Thank you," she said simply, sitting beside him on the steps. "For the doctor, for bringing us here, for everything." He nodded, continuing to work the knife carefully around the wood. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Josephine corrected him. "They wouldn't. We've learned that the hard way." Sheriff Jones was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling. "Rebecca told you about Sarah, a little." He set aside his whittling. "After Sarah died, I spent a year hunting the man responsible for delaying me on that prisoner transfer. Turned out he was just a petty thief who made a bad decision. Killing him wouldn't have brought her back." His gaze lifted to the distant mountains. Took me another year to figure out what would honor her memory better than revenge. Helping others, Josephine guessed. Something like that. He stood, brushing wood shavings from his pants. There's a position open at the Mercantile. Owner's looking for someone with a good head for figures. Thought you might be interested. Josephine blinked in surprise. How did you know I'm good with numbers? A small smile touched his lips. The way you calculated the doctor's fee before he even mentioned it. Quick in your head. She found herself returning his smile. I kept the books for my husband's carpentry business. Figured as much. He handed her the wooden carving, a small, delicate rose. Mercantile opens at 9. Mr. Garfield's a fair employer. With that, he descended the steps and headed toward the sheriff's office, leaving Josephine holding the wooden rose and feeling, for the first time in months, like she might have found solid ground. The following weeks brought significant changes for the three widows. Elizabeth's health improved slowly under Rebecca's careful nursing. Margaret found work at the hotel, her no-nonsense efficiency quickly making her indispensable to the owner. And Josephine, as Sheriff Jones had predicted, was hired at the Mercantile, where her skill with numbers and inventory impressed Mr. Garfield enough that he soon trusted her to manage the books entirely. They moved from Rebecca's boarding house to a small cottage on the edge of town that she owned and rented to them at a modest price. It wasn't much, 2 rooms with a lean-to kitchen, but it was theirs, at least temporarily. In the evenings, they would sit on the narrow porch, watching the sunset and marveling at how their desperate walk to nowhere had led them here. Sheriff Jones became a regular visitor, often bringing game he'd hunted or vegetables from his small garden. Josephine found herself looking forward to these visits, appreciating his quiet strength and the way he seemed to understand their need to rebuild their dignity along with their lives. One evening in late August, he arrived at the cottage with his fishing rod and a string of trout. "Thought you ladies might appreciate something fresh for dinner," he said, handing the cleaned fish to Margaret, who had become an excellent cook with access to proper ingredients. "You're spoiling us, Sheriff," Elizabeth teased, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Yancey," he corrected. "Think we're past titles at this point." Josephine noticed he glanced at her as he said this, and she felt a curious warmth spread through her chest. As Margaret prepared the fish, Yancey and Josephine sat on the porch steps, watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk. "Mr. Garfield says you've increased his profits by 15%, Yancey commented. Josephine smiled. "Just improved his inventory system. He was ordering too much of what doesn't sell and not enough of what does. Smart." He seemed to hesitate before continuing. "I've been meaning to ask. Have you given any thought to staying in Willits? Permanently, I mean." The question caught her off guard. We haven't really discussed it. Might be worth considering. Town's growing. Stagecoach brings new folks through regularly. Good place to build something new." There was something in his tone that made Josephine look at him more closely. "Are you asking for a particular reason, Yancey?" He met her gaze steadily. "Might be." Before she could respond, Margaret called them in for dinner, and the moment passed, though Josephine found herself replaying his words throughout the meal. After dinner, as Yancey prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. "Almost forgot. There's a harvest dance at the church next Saturday. Whole town will be there." He directed this at all 3 women, but his eyes lingered on Josephine. "Thought you might enjoy meeting more folks from around these parts." After he left, Margaret raised an eyebrow at Josephine. "The sheriff seems quite interested in your future plans." "He's just being neighborly," Josephine protested, though her heart wasn't in the denial. Elizabeth, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Joseph never looked at you the way Sheriff Jones does." Josephine felt her cheeks grow warm. Joseph Parker had been a practical man who'd married her largely because her father had been his mentor in carpentry. Their marriage had been based on mutual respect rather than passion, and while she had mourned him sincerely, she knew Elizabeth spoke the truth. "It's too soon," she said softly. Margaret's expression softened. "Is it? We've been here nearly 2 months. Life doesn't wait for grief to finish its work, Joe. And grief doesn't end just because new feelings begin," Elizabeth added wisely. Josephine absently twisted her wedding band. "I'm not ready to take this off." "No one's asking you to," Margaret assured her. "But perhaps you could make room for something else alongside your memories." The idea lingered with Josephine as she lay in bed that night. Was it disloyal to feel this flutter of interest in another man? Or was it, as Elizabeth suggested, simply life's persistent way of moving forward even when we think we can't? The harvest dance arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp air and golden sunshine that turned the surrounding hills into a patchwork of amber and russet. The entire town gathered at the church, which had been transformed with bunting, hay bales, and tables laden with food brought by every family. The three widows arrived together, wearing their best dresses, which Rebecca had helped alter to better fit current styles. They were greeted warmly by many townspeople, no longer strangers but neighbors who had come to respect their resilience. Yancey found Josephine by the punch bowl, looking handsome in a clean white shirt and dark vest, his badge temporarily retired for the festivities. "You came," he said, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "We did," she confirmed, suddenly shy. "It's a lovely gathering. Willits knows how to celebrate." He glanced at the fiddlers who were tuning their instruments. "They'll be starting the dancing soon." "Would you honor me with the first one?" Josephine hesitated, aware of curious glances from nearby townsfolk. "I'm not sure I remember how." "It's like riding a horse," he said, offering his hand. "Your feet will remember even if your mind doesn't." She placed her hand in his, surprised at the spark of connection she felt at his touch. As the music began, Yancey led her into a lively reel, his hand firm at her waist. To her amazement, her body did remember, and soon she was laughing as they spun around the floor. "You've been holding out on me, Miss Parker," Yancey teased as they caught their breath between dances. "You're quite the dancer." "My father insisted all his daughters learn," she admitted. "Said it was as important as reading and ciphering. Wise man." He led her toward the doors. "Would you like to step outside for some air?" They walked to a quiet spot beneath an oak tree where lanterns cast a gentle glow. In the distance, they could still hear the music and laughter from the church. "I have something to tell you," Yancey said, his expression turning serious. "Got a telegram yesterday from the sheriff in Sacramento. They've arrested Maxwell Blackwell." Josephine's breath caught. "The mine owner, the one who abandoned us after the collapse." Yancey nodded. "He's being charged with criminal negligence. Apparently, he ignored safety reports about the mine's condition, and there's evidence he embezzled company funds that should have gone to safety improvements. What does this mean for us, for the widows? It means there might be a case for proper compensation. The state seized his assets pending trial." He took her hand. "I've already written to the prosecutor about your situation. They'll need testimonies eventually." Josephine felt dizzy with this news. "Margaret and Elizabeth will be, I don't even know. This could change everything." "That's not all," Yancey continued, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "I've been offered a position as deputy marshal for the Northern District. Would mean more responsibility, better pay, but also more travel." Her heart sank at these words. "You're leaving Willits?" "Not exactly. I'd still be based here, but I'd need to ride circuit." He stepped closer. "The thing is, Josephine, I don't want to accept it unless—" He took a deep breath. "Unless I know you might be waiting when I return. Time seemed to stand still as she absorbed his words. "Yancey, I know it's sudden," he interrupted. "And I know you're still healing. I'm not asking for promises, just possibility." Josephine looked down at their joined hands, then back up to his earnest face. "When Sarah died," she said carefully, "did you think you'd ever feel this way again?" Pain flashed across his features, but he answered honestly, "No, I thought that part of me died with her. That's how I felt when Joseph died, not because our love was so grand, but because I thought I'd used up my chance." She squeezed his hand. "I was wrong, wasn't I?" The hope that dawned in his eyes was answer enough. Slowly, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, just above her wedding ring. "Take all the time you need, Josephine. I'm not going anywhere, at least not for long." As they rejoined the dance, something had shifted between them, a promise not yet spoken but understood nonetheless. News of Blackwell's arrest spread quickly through Willits. For Elizabeth and Margaret, it rekindled both grief and hope. The possibility of justice and proper compensation meant they might truly be able to start over, not just survive. "We could buy the cottage from Rebecca," Margaret mused one evening as they discussed the future. "Make it our own." Elizabeth, whose health had continued to improve with the cleaner air and better food of Willits, nodded thoughtfully. "Or perhaps separate homes. We've lived in each other's pockets for months now." Josephine felt a pang at this. Despite the circumstances that had thrown them together, she'd come to think of these women as sisters. "Whatever happens with the trial, we'll always have each other," she said firmly. Margaret gave her a knowing look. "And you'll have the sheriff, I suspect." Josephine blushed but didn't deny it. Over the weeks since the harvest dance, her relationship with Yancey had deepened. They'd shared long walks, quiet conversations, and gradually, pieces of their pasts. She'd told him about her childhood in Oregon, her arranged marriage to Joseph, and her secret dreams of owning a shop someday. He'd revealed his years as a Union soldier, his brief time gold prospecting, and how becoming sheriff had given him purpose when grief threatened to consume him. "I haven't decided anything," she said, though her heart argued otherwise. Elizabeth smiled. "Your face decides for you whenever he's near." Before Josephine could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. It was Rebecca, her expression troubled. "Yancey asked me to come. He's been called away suddenly, posse forming to chase a gang that robbed the mail coach near Ukiah." She handed Josephine a folded note. "He said to give you this." Josephine read it privately, tears welling as she absorbed his hastily written words. "I'll return as soon as I can. Please consider what we discussed. My heart remains in Willits with you." Why? He'd been asking her, with increasing openness, to consider a future together. Each time, she deferred, claiming she needed more time, though in truth, her hesitation had less to do with readiness than fear that happiness might be snatched away again if she dared to grasp it. Days turned into a week with no word from Yancey or the posse. Josephine threw herself into work at the Mercantile, but anxiety followed her like a shadow. Finally, late one afternoon, the distant sound of approaching riders drew everyone to the main street. The posse returned dusty and weary, 2 men nursing minor wounds. Josephine scanned the riders desperately until she spotted Yancey at the rear, leading a horse bearing a blanket-wrapped form. 3 bandits captured, 1 killed, reported Deputy Miller to the gathered crowd. Got most of the mail back. Josephine pushed through the onlookers to reach Yancey as he dismounted. Up close, she could see the exhaustion etched in his face, along with a healing cut above his right eye. "You're hurt," she said, reaching up instinctively to touch his face. He caught her hand, pressing it to his cheek. "Nothing serious." His voice was rough with fatigue, "just glad to be home." The simple statement and the way his eyes held hers as he said it settled something inside her. Home wasn't a place, it was a feeling of belonging. And despite everything, she belonged here now with him. "I need to see to the prisoners," he said reluctantly, "and make arrangements for Larson." He nodded toward the blanket-covered body. "But after?" "I'll be at the cottage," she promised. "Come when you can." It was past midnight when he finally arrived. Margaret and Elizabeth had retired, leaving Josephine waiting alone by the stove, a pot of coffee warming for him. He accepted the cup gratefully, the warmth seeming to revive him somewhat. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments before he spoke. "I've had a lot of time to think this past week," he said, setting down his cup. "Every night under those stars I thought about what matters, what I'd regret not saying if things went wrong." Josephine's heart quickened. "And what would that be?" Yancey reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it out to her. It was a ring, a simple silver band with a small pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained. "She gave it to me before she died, said to give it to the woman who made me want to be a better man." He took her hand. "That's you, Josephine. I love you. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Tears blurred her vision as emotion overwhelmed her. All her carefully reasoned hesitations seemed to evaporate in the face of this moment. "I was so afraid," she whispered, "afraid to trust happiness again." "I know," he said gently. "So was I, but I'm more afraid of missing this chance, our chance." Josephine looked down at her left hand, where Joseph's ring still rested. With trembling fingers, she removed it for the first time since his death, carefully placing it in her pocket. "Joseph gave me stability when I needed it," she said softly. "He was a good man, and I'll always honor his memory. But you—" She met Yancey's gaze. "You make me feel alive again." She extended her now bare hand to him. "Yes, Yancey Jones, I'll marry you." His smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds as he slipped his mother's ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her. When he kissed her, gently at first and then with growing passion, Josephine felt the last shadows of her grief give way to the promise of new beginnings. The wedding took place in November, a small ceremony in the same church where they danced at the Harvest Festival. Rebecca stood beside Josephine as matron of honor, while Elizabeth and Margaret watched from the front pew, their faces reflecting genuine joy for their friend, Dr. Harrison gave the bride away, and Mayor Thompson, an old friend of Yancey's, performed the ceremony. The entire town turned out to celebrate, bringing food and gifts to the reception held at the hotel. "Never thought I'd see the day," Deputy Miller teased during the festivities. "Our confirmed bachelor sheriff, tamed at last." "Not tamed," Yancey corrected, his arm securely around Josephine's waist. "Just finally found where I belong." Later, as they danced slowly to a gentle fiddle tune, Josephine rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "What are you thinking?" he murmured into her hair. "That 3 months ago I was walking toward nowhere, certain my life was over." She looked up at him. "And now I'm here, starting a new chapter I never imagined possible." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Sometimes the best destinations are the ones we don't plan for." As winter settled over Willits, the newlyweds established their routine in Yancey's house, a comfortable 2-story home not far from the sheriff's office. Josephine continued working at the Mercantile while also making the house truly theirs, adding touches of color and comfort to the previously bachelor quarters. Margaret and Elizabeth remained in the cottage, which they now rented directly from Rebecca. Elizabeth's health continued to improve, and by Christmas, she was well enough to accept a position teaching at the small town school. Margaret's efficiency had earned her a promotion to hotel manager when the previous manager left for San Francisco. In February, news arrived that the trial against Maxwell Blackwell had concluded with a guilty verdict. The court ordered restitution to be paid to the families of all miners killed in the collapse, including substantial settlements for the 3 widows. "What will you do with your share?" Yancey asked Josephine as they discussed the news over dinner. She had been considering this question since the telegram arrived. "I want to open a shop," she decided. "Not just any shop, a bookstore with a small lending library. Willits needs more books." His eyes crinkled with approval. "You'd be good at that. I've seen how you devour any reading material that comes your way. And I want to help Margaret and Elizabeth with whatever they choose," she added. "We walked into nowhere together. It seems right that we should build our somewheres together too." As spring returned to California, bringing wildflowers and warmer days, more changes came to Willits. The railroad surveyors arrived, mapping a route that would eventually connect the town to larger markets. New families moved in, attracted by the town's growing prosperity and relative peace. Yancey officially accepted the deputy marshal position, though he negotiated terms that kept his absences shorter and less frequent than originally proposed. Each time he returned from his circuit, Josephine would meet him at the edge of town, their reunions growing sweeter with each homecoming. It was after one such return in early April that Josephine shared her most significant news. "I have something to tell you," she said that night as they sat on their porch watching the stars emerge. He smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You've been practically bursting with it since I got back." "What is it?" "Dr. Harrison confirmed it yesterday." She took his hand and placed it gently over her still flat abdomen. "We're going to have a baby." The wonder that transformed his face was something Josephine knew she would remember forever. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." "Due in November," she confirmed, "almost exactly a year after our wedding." He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of precious glass. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed. "After Sarah, I convinced myself some men weren't meant for family life. And now I can't imagine anything else." He kissed her tenderly. "I love you, Josephine Jones. You and our child-to-be." Margaret and Elizabeth were equally thrilled with the news, immediately beginning plans for a quilt and baby clothes. The settlement money from Blackwell had allowed both women to pursue their own dreams as well. Margaret had purchased part ownership in the hotel, while Elizabeth had started a small seamstress business alongside her teaching duties. As Josephine's pregnancy progressed, her bookshop plans took tangible shape. She found a vacant storefront next to the Mercantile and set about transforming it, ordering inventory from publishers in San Francisco and commissioning local carpenter Sam Wilson to build shelves and counters. "I was thinking," she told Yancey one evening as they reviewed her business plans, "of calling it New Chapter Books and Lending Library." He smiled at the appropriateness of the name. "Perfect, just like its owner." By September, with Josephine's pregnancy well advanced, the shop was ready to open. The entire town turned out for the grand opening, marveling at the selection of books and the comfortable reading nooks Josephine had created. "This is exactly what Willits needed," Mayor Thompson declared as he browsed the shelves. "A place of learning and imagination." Elizabeth had brought her students, who gazed wide-eyed at more books than most had ever seen in one place. "Miss Josephine will let you borrow books if you promise to take special care of them," she explained to the children. Margaret, ever practical, had gifted Josephine with a meticulously designed ledger system for tracking loans and inventory. "So you don't have to worry about the details when the baby comes," she said. That evening, as they closed the shop after a successful first day, Yancey found Josephine sitting quietly in one of the reading chairs, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "Happy?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "More than I have words for," she admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if this is all a dream, the shop, the baby, you." He took her hands in his. "If it is, we're dreaming it together." She smiled, then gasped as the baby delivered a particularly enthusiastic kick. "Your son or daughter seems to agree." "Strong like their mother," Yancey said proudly, placing his hand alongside hers to feel the movement. As November approached, Josephine reluctantly turned daily operations of the shop over to Clara Peterson, a young widow who had recently moved to Willits and eagerly accepted the position. Yancey arranged his duties to keep him close to home, much to the amusement of Deputy Miller, who teased that he'd never seen his boss so jumpy. Their son, James Thomas Jones, arrived on a crisp November morning after a difficult but ultimately successful labor. Dr. Harrison pronounced him perfectly healthy, with his father's strong lungs and his mother's determined spirit, as evidenced by his robust cries. Cradling his son for the first time, Yancey seemed transformed, the last vestiges of the grief-hardened man, who had found 3 desperate widows on a dusty trail, completely melted away by the tiny fingers that wrapped instinctively around his own. "He's perfect," he whispered, carefully returning the newborn to Josephine's arms, "just like his mother." Exhausted but radiant, Josephine gazed at her child with wonder. "He's our new beginning, Yancey, the chapter we're writing together." Rebecca, who had assisted during the birth, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the new family. "Sarah would be happy for you," she told her brother softly. "She'd want this for you." For a moment, acknowledgement of this truth hung in the air between them, not painful anymore, but a gentle recognition that love lost had somehow led to love found. The winter passed in a blur of midnight feedings, first smiles, and the sweet exhaustion of new parenthood. Margaret and Elizabeth became honorary aunts to little James, spoiling him with attention and handmade gifts. The bookshop thrived under Clara's management, with Josephine visiting regularly, often with James bundled against her chest. When spring arrived again, bringing the first anniversary of the news that had changed everything, Yancey suggested a picnic on the hill, overlooking Willits, the same hill where Josephine had first glimpsed the town that would become her home. As they sat on a blanket watching 5-month-old James attempt to roll over in the grass, Yancey pulled Josephine close against his side. "You ever think about it?" he asked. "What might have happened if I hadn't found you that day?" Josephine considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. We might have reached another town eventually, or not." She shuddered slightly. "But I believe some things are meant to be, Yancey. You were meant to find us, and I was meant to find you." He kissed her temple. "I rode out that day because something told me to check the Eastern Trail. Hadn't been that way in months." "Providence," Josephine murmured. "Or Sarah looking out for me," he suggested quietly. Josephine squeezed his hand, knowing this acknowledgement was a gift of trust. "Either way, I'm grateful." James chose that moment to succeed in his rolling attempt, gurgling with delight at his achievement. Both parents laughed, the sound carrying across the valley toward the town below. In the distance, they could see Elizabeth walking with a group of students, conducting some sort of nature study. Near the hotel, Margaret's distinctive figure directed deliverymen unloading supplies from a wagon. The railroad construction had reached the outskirts of town, bringing with it new opportunities and growth. "Look at what we've built," Yancey said, his gaze encompassing the town and their son. "All of us together." Josephine leaned against his shoulder, contentment filling her completely. From nowhere to somewhere, from emptiness to fullness. From walking away to coming home, Yancey added, completing the thought. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting golden light across the landscape. The small family gathered their belongings and walked down the hill toward Willits. Not as desperate travelers this time, but as people who had found their place in the world, a home built from the ashes of tragedy. A love formed in the space between grief and hope, and a future bright with possibilities they were creating together, one day at a time. 2 years later, the Jones family had expanded with the arrival of twin daughters, Emily and Sarah, bringing joyful chaos to their household. The bookshop had grown too, now occupying both the original space and the adjacent storefront, with a dedicated children's section that had become a favorite gathering place for Willits's youngest residents. Yancey had been officially appointed marshal for the Northern District, a position that came with greater responsibility, but also the ability to delegate more of the traveling duties to deputies. He was home more consistently now, building a reputation for fair justice across the region while still finding time to teach young James to fish and rock the twins to sleep. One summer evening, as Willits celebrated the completion of the railroad connection with a town-wide festival, the former widows found a quiet moment together amid the revelry. "Could you have imagined this?" Elizabeth asked, watching her fiancé, schoolmaster William Grant, demonstrating a scientific principle to a group of fascinated children. Her health fully restored, she had become an indispensable part of the town's growing school, her quiet intelligence earning respect from parents and children alike. "Not in my wildest dreams," Margaret admitted, adjusting her hat against the setting sun. Her hotel now boasted a restaurant that drew travelers from miles around, and her recent marriage to widower Everett Simmons, a cattle rancher whose land bordered Willits, had given her both love and the large family she'd always secretly wanted through his 4 children. Josephine, bouncing Sarah on her hip while Emily slept in a nearby carriage, smiled at her friends. "We walked away from everything we knew, certain there was nothing ahead, and found everything we needed instead," Elizabeth finished. Yancey approached, little James riding proudly on his shoulders. "Ladies," he greeted them, bowing slightly, which made James giggle. "The mayor's about to make a speech, and I've been instructed to gather all important citizens." "That would be us, I suppose," Margaret said with mock seriousness. As they moved toward the platform where Mayor Thompson waited, Josephine fell into step beside her husband. "Happy?" he asked, echoing the question he'd asked her many times over the years. She looked around at the thriving town, at her friends who had become family, at her children, and finally at the man who had turned them around when they were lost. "Beyond measure," she replied, taking his free hand. "This is better than happiness, Yancey. This is home." The town of Willits continued to grow and prosper in the years that followed. The railroad brought new businesses, new families, and connected the once isolated community to the wider world. Yet it maintained its character as a place where neighbors looked out for one another and second chances weren't just possible but celebrated. The 3 women who had once walked toward nowhere, bound together by grief and desperation, remained at the heart of the community they had helped shape. Their friendship endured through joys and sorrows, their shared history creating a bond that neither time nor circumstance could weaken. And in the Jones household, where laughter and books filled every corner, Josephine would sometimes tell her children the story of how their father had found her and her friends on a dusty trail, how he'd turned them around when they had no destination, and how love had grown in the space where hope had almost died. "That's how you know real love," she would tell them as Yancey listened from the doorway, his eyes still holding the same warmth they had on that first meeting. "It finds you even when you aren't looking, guides you home when you've lost your way, and builds something beautiful from what seems like nothing at all." In the end, that was the legacy of the three widows and the cowboy who saved them, not just their individual stories of survival and renewal, but the lesson that sometimes the longest journey leads exactly where you're meant to be, and the hearts that seem most broken are the ones most ready to love again.